O Lord God, we have come today because we want to know you by knowing your Son, and because we want to know ourselves by knowing your Son. We thank you that you sent your Son to judge the world, but not to condemn the world. Rather, you sent your Son to judge the world that the world might be saved through him. As we learn about and reflect upon the world of history into which you sent your Son, help us to hear the word you speak to us today, the word of judgment and of grace. To this end, bless our teacher and his words today, as well as our hearing, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
I think I should be. All right, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all again. It's always nice. I think I said this last week, but when I talk and then people come back, it's always gratifying. So thank you. So today our topic is this: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and Jewish legal concepts. And the reason I want to talk about these groups is because the Sadducees, and especially the Pharisees, are important for understanding the New Testament, and that they appear in the New Testament a good bit. So I'm going to explain a little bit about Jewish sects or parties, and the Sadducees and Pharisees were two of those sects or parties. And I want to talk about the importance of the Torah or law in first century Judaism as well. Okay? Before we really jump into that, I think I figured out how to do what I wanted to do last week. Yes, you can see this. That's good. And you can see that. All right, what I'm going to show you is a virtual reality tour, in a sense, of the Jerusalem temple. If it'll start going. It should start going. Let's play. All right, now we're going. And I wanted to start here because if there are two T's that are important in first century Judaism, it's temple and Torah, or temple and law. Okay, so this temple part is a bit of a review from last week, and then we'll jump into another important facet of understanding first century Jewish life. So this is the temple, the model at least, of what Jesus would have seen. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but we know pretty close to what it looked like. And what I want you to see is how much the temple dominated the skyline of the city of Jerusalem. So right now we're coming up from the lowest part of the city. This is in the south. And you're coming up the stairs. So if you know the story of Jesus healing a man at the pool of Siloam, it would have been where these stairs start. And then you would walk up these stairs to get to the temple. Okay? And once you get to here, this would have been one of the busiest areas in first century Jerusalem. Some people have called this the Wall Street of ancient Jerusalem. And that tons of commerce would have happened here. So if you had the means, you could have a shop. You could put your little cart there, a little something, and you could buy and sell because so many pilgrims were coming in and out of the temple. It was a fabulous place to have a small business. And when Jesus goes into the temple in all four Gospels and gets upset and knocks over the tables of the money changers and those selling animals, some of that business would have happened outside, right outside here, and some of that may have been moving inside, which may have been one of the reasons why Jesus got upset, because some of that commerce was happening inside the temple area and not just outside. All right, so this is panning now to the southern side of the Temple Mount. There would have been massive staircases to get into the temple, and you would go, I always forget, but there's 2 gates here, 3 gates here, and you go in one and out the other, but I can never remember which one is which. But there was traffic control, right? Because so many people were going in and out that the idea was you'd go in one, especially during high traffic days, meaning festival days. There was definitely an in and an out. And I think I said last week that Jerusalem's population was maybe 150,000. But on festival days, especially on a festival like Passover, another 250 to 500,000 Jews would come. And so your population would more than double. That's a lot of people coming, especially at Passover, but that Passover was not the only day that Jews would come from all over the world. Okay? So in order for that to happen, you'd have to have a big place to keep everyone and lots of food, sacrifice material, so animals, wood, all sorts of things. Okay, so what this is showing you is if you went up the stairs, you'd go into kind of an underground tunnel, and I'm going to fast forward a little bit here, and you would come up, and then you'd see the temple in front of you. So we're on the Temple Mount complex, the huge rectangular platform that Herod built, and then you could see the temple. And the smoke is the altar where the sacrifices would have been performed. This huge area that we're in right now, there's a barrier. So it was about 4 feet high, and this barrier is representing it right here. And there would have been a sign on about every other one that said, "No foreigner or alien may pass beyond this point upon pain of death." So only Jews could go past this barrier. So this was called the court of the Gentiles, or the court of the nations. Jews and Gentiles could both be in this part, but only Jews could go beyond it. And then once you went in, I think I said last week that only Jewish men could go after a certain point, and then only Jewish priests could go, and then only the high priest. So there were different areas where Jews could go, where you knew where you stood vis-a-vis Jews and Gentiles, male and female, or priests or non-priests.
When you say the sacrifice happens there with the smoke, is the sacrifice when you kill the animal or when you burn it?
Well, both, really. I mean,
that all happens right there.
It would have happened in there. That's right. And I think I mentioned last week that there are a number of different types of sacrifices. So some you would burn the entire animal, some you would just burn a portion, and some you wouldn't burn at all. So the sacrifices, I think, would have happened inside there, but then sometimes you'd have to go to the altar and sacrifice, and burn some. Okay, these are the openings that you'd come up. So you'd come in underground and you come up here. This is sometimes called the royal portico, or the royal stoa. And I was kind of waiting to show you this because it's an impressive part of the whole platform. Huge pillars, and it's 2 stories. King Herod was not Jewish, in that, he was half Jewish. He could not go into the temple proper because he was not fully Jewish. So he built this 2-story end to the Temple Mount so he could look down from the 2nd story into the temple complex and see what was happening. And so when he brought important visitors, he could show off what he'd built. Right? And a lot of people think that when Jesus goes into the temple and knocks over tables and stuff, that it's in this pillared area right here. That's what a lot of people think. Okay? We don't know for sure, but that would make the most sense. And then I'm going to fast forward again.
You said upon pain of death they couldn't go in. If Herod went in, is anybody going to kill Herod?
Well, that's a great question. So the question is, if you couldn't pass beyond that barrier upon pain of death, what if Herod went in? Are the Jews really going to kill King Herod? That's the question. It's a good question. I don't know, to be honest with you. But I do think that mob violence works in strange ways, right? So there is the sense that one person, like a few people, might see it happening, and if they get upset, then other people who don't know who it is might run over, and you don't know what's going to happen. Now, there's no evidence that anyone was ever killed. Either no Gentile ever passed the barrier, or the warning was for warning purposes, but the Jews couldn't really enforce it, and we don't really know. But there's no evidence of someone trying to pass it, trying to go beyond that barrier. Okay, I froze it here. Because on the southwest corner of the temple, it was one of the highest spots, actually the 2nd highest spot. There's a guy who blew a trumpet, and there was actually a shofar, so a ram's horn, and so he would announce when the Sabbath was starting, when the Sabbath was ending, when certain festivals were starting. It was kind of the town crier in a sense, but with a big ram's horn. And we know for sure that the guy stood right here. And here's why. Because there's an inscription right here. It says, "This is where the guy stands who blows the trumpet." So, one of those things you can say for sure. That was the spot. Now, this stone doesn't. When the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in the year 70 A.D. by the Romans destroyed the temple. So the big building on the top was destroyed. But this big platform was not. The Romans couldn't destroy it. It was too well built. But they did knock over as much as they could. This stone was knocked over, but it was found about 100 feet below in the pavement. So they knew exactly that this is where the Romans had pushed off this stone and it dropped and it landed, and they found it about 50 years ago. So that's how you know, like one of those things you can say exactly, it happened right here. It's kind of fun. All right, and I go forward just a little bit more, and I just want you to, again, to see the scope of this building. This is a massive, massive building. So the temple, so that was all by way of review in a sense. The temple was a really, really important facet of first century Jewish life. In many ways, you can't have Judaism in the first century without having the temple. And some of the reasons for that are because God is supposed to dwell in a special way in the temple. So Jews knew that God could live everywhere, that God was bigger than the temple, but they also knew that God had said he would choose to dwell in a specific place where Jews could go and kind of commune with God. Okay? So God was there in a special way, and that is where you could sacrifice animals. You could do all sorts of other things in Judaism: prayer, almsgiving, worship, reading the Torah. You could do all of that anywhere, but you could only sacrifice in the temple. That was another thing that kind of made the Jerusalem temple the center of Jewish life, whether you lived in Israel proper or you lived in any part of the Roman Empire. Okay? All right, a second thing, now I'm going to close this. A second thing that made a second thing that really was central to Jewish first century practice and belief was the Torah. So the Torah is another way of saying law. Jews prefer the term Torah, and the term Torah means a number of different things in Judaism. Technically, it refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is Torah. The reason it's Torah is because that's where God's teachings are. If you want to talk about where the law is or where the commandments are, well, a lot of it is in those first 5 books. But Torah doesn't just mean those first 5 books. It also means everything that God gave. So all of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And for some, it means more than that. It means any reflection upon the Old Testament. Any later commandments or laws that developed in trying to understand what those first 5 books say, that's also Torah. It's what God commanded. That's Torah. Yes?
Don't go back to the slide, but I'm going to go back. The temple never would have functioned as a fortress, correct?
It wasn't designed to function as a fortress.
I'm just wondering about beautiful structure. What was the purpose of destroying? As much to destroy the religious ethos of the people?
Right. So the question is then, why would the Romans destroy the temple? Is that partly your question? Okay. So you're right. It was not technically designed as a fortress, although it functioned as a fortress. So Herod's huge platform, the Romans, they got through one wall, they got through a second wall, then they finally had to get into the Temple Mount. And some of the Jewish rebels were hiding out on the Temple Mount. And so one reason why the Romans maybe destroyed the temple and tried to destroy the platform too is because it did function as a fortress, even though it wasn't designed to do that. But also, so in the year 70, I'll answer your question this way. In the year 70, the Romans destroyed the temple because there was a Jewish revolt. In the year 132, there was another Jewish revolt, a second Jewish revolt, that ended in 135. And at that time, the Romans said, we're done with Jerusalem. And they expelled Jews from Jerusalem. No Jew could live within like 50 miles of Jerusalem. And so I think they had an inkling of this in 72, that as long as Jerusalem was a major city, this was a place where if Jews were going to rebel, they were going to come to this city and rebel. So they tried to destroy what they could so that it wouldn't become kind of a hotbed of revolt again. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. So when Christians think about law, they often think about the 10 Commandments, right? So that's what this is, Moses getting the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Now in Judaism, there are not just 10 Commandments. In fact, if you count them, I've never actually done it, but there are 613 commandments. The first one is be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 1:28. That's the first command. And then all from Genesis through Deuteronomy, there are 613. But Jews would say you can kind of encapsulate, you can summarize those 613 with the 10 Commandments. And if you want to even summarize the 10 Commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You do those two things, you've obeyed the law. Okay, so there are different summaries that could be given. But the Torah are these commands from God that God has given. Now there's the handout that I gave you. I want you to look at the third statement, or the third passage. And if you don't have it, you can look on with someone, or there's some in the back. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, this particular saying. The Babylonian Talmud was written about the 5th or 6th century AD, so it's much after the New Testament. But as with a lot of Jewish rabbinic sources, it contains a lot of earlier material. And this particular saying mentions two people, Shammai and Hillel. They were Pharisees a generation before Jesus, so roughly the same time. And here's a statement this is one of the most famous stories in rabbinic literature. It happened that a certain heathen came before Shammai and said to him, "Convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I am standing on one foot." And Shammai drove him away with a builder's measuring stick that was in his hand. So he beat him. He then came before Hillel, who converted him. Hillel said to him, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. This is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it." If you can love your neighbor, you are fulfilling the law. That's what he says. Okay? Now, I give you this partly because I think it's a great story, but partly because I think it also tells us something about the importance of Torah in the first century and in subsequent centuries after that. So Shammai is right. You cannot learn the entire Torah, even if you just say 613 commandments and not make it even broader than that. You can't learn it all standing on one foot in one afternoon. All right? So he says, don't even waste my time. Hillel, a different Pharisee, has a different way of thinking about this. He says, yes, you can convert, you can become Jewish, as long as you love your neighbor, but he doesn't say you're finished. He says, go and learn the rest of it later. Right? So he's not saying you're done. He's saying it's going to take you a long time to learn Torah. But if you get the central part, then you can keep going. Then you can go and learn it. Okay? Both of them are assuming that Torah is really important. And so what you see in first century Judaism then is the temple being important, but then Torah or texts being important. People are starting to think about what it means to be Jewish, and what it means to be Jewish is to read a text and to obey the text. Okay? Not every ancient religion had a text the way that Jews did. Okay, you can put your handout down for now. I'll come back to it in a little bit. In terms of Jewish law, so these are things that were in the Jewish law, in the Torah, and they were things that marked Jews. Anywhere you lived in the Roman Empire, this would have been true of a Jew, in that they would have thought that these things were important. I'm going to explain some of them a little bit, okay? It doesn't mean that they all thought them the same way, but in theory, they all thought these things were important, okay? So, in Genesis, God says that the Israelites, his people, are supposed to observe the Sabbath, to keep it holy. Okay, so Sabbath observance would have been something that was important throughout the Roman world. The Sabbath, as with every Jewish day, starts at sundown. So today, Friday night at sundown starts the Sabbath. Saturday night at sundown ends the Sabbath. So you invite the Sabbath in and an evening meal, and then there's another evening meal where you go back to normal time. So you're kind of in sacred time for a day. Okay? The Jews have a very strong sense of time, of sacredness of time. And so the idea is that you take one day out and you don't work, because God didn't work. So Jews in the first century would have agreed on this. This is important. Whether they all would have practiced it or observed it in the same way, it's a different story. But in theory, they all thought it was important. But the practice of it, that's when you start getting to sectarian things, or the things that divide people like the Pharisees and Sadducees and other groups. Because how you practice these things, that's a matter of interpretation. So for instance, and we'll come back to it, I think, Sabbath observance. What constitutes work? If you can't work on the Sabbath, who gets to define what work is? I guess. It could be up to the individual, right? But Judaism is not a very individualistic society. It's a very communal society. So let's think about eating food on the Sabbath. Can you prepare food on the Sabbath? Can you cook? The answer is no, because you can't light a fire. And this is in the days before refrigerators and freezers and lots of preservatives that aren't good for us anyway. So you would cook every day. Except the Sabbath, right? So you can't cook then. So you have to prepare your kind of double food the day before. But let's say you did prepare the food before. Can you carry the food from like a counter to a table to eat it? Is that work? Can you go to your neighbor's house carrying food and have a potluck? And here's another thing, too. Sometimes a festival like Passover would happen the day before the Sabbath. Passover, you're allowed to cook on. The Sabbath, you're not. So it means you can't prepare food on the Passover for the Sabbath, because you can only prepare food for that day on the Passover. You can't prepare food for the next day. That means you have to preparing food 2 days before for the Sabbath. That might not taste as good. These are all problems, but you can't fast on the Sabbath because it's not a fasting day. You can't just choose not to eat. So what do? These are the kinds of things that all sorts of people had opinions on in the first century, including groups like the Pharisees and Sadducees. Right? So one of the things that divided groups in Judaism were how you interpret the law. How do you decide how you practice the law? Because the law is important, everyone agrees, but how you do it can vary. I'll give you one other example, and then I'll go back to this list. Okay? The calendar. Judaism works on a lunar calendar. Actually, it's a lunar solar calendar. It's both. On a lunar calendar, there are 354 days in a year. In our calendar, we have 365 days in the year. Right? So every lunar year is 11.25 days shorter than a solar year. If this goes right over your head, don't worry about it. Okay? There are certain festivals. I'm going to keep talking about Passover because it's the most important one, I think. Passover always has to be in the spring. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, always has to be in the fall. If you have a 354-day calendar, it's not going to take very long until Passover is now in the winter, and then the fall, and then the summer, and finally back in the spring again. So you have to make sure it stays in the right season. And so Jews added a 13th month. There's a fancy word for it, but it just means they added a 13th month. They do this today. In the Jewish religious calendar, a 13th month is added every couple of years to make sure that the festivals stay in the right period of time, in the right season. This is one reason why, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but why Passover will move around. Easter and Passover technically are not combined because Christians wanted to say we decide Easter's date not on Passover's date, but really, they're always together. Okay? This is why Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, those big Jewish holidays, the Day of Atonement, they're always in the fall, but they always move around. They're always in October-ish, but they're not always in the same day. It's because of this lunar calendar. Okay? Who gets to decide when you add a 13th month? And if Passover happens to land on a Sabbath because you're changing the calendar, can you do that? And some Jewish groups said yes, and some Jewish groups said no. So the Essenes, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, we'll talk about them next week, they said, no, you cannot do that. But the high priest in Jerusalem said, yes, we can. And so these are the kinds of things now, in some ways, these seem trivial, seem unimportant. But if God gave the law, then you want to know how to follow it. You want to obey it. And then these things aren't just trivial. They're important because you want to actually obey what God commanded you. Okay? All right. It's a long jump off. Sabbath observance was important. Circumcision was important. All Jews agreed with this. So male infants, on their 8th day, they were circumcised. It was a sign that you were part of the covenant. It comes from Genesis 17. The dietary laws. These are a little more complicated. The dietary laws were such that God, this is twice in Exodus, twice in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy, there's some specific teaching, but definitely in Exodus. It talks about there are certain foods that are kosher and certain foods that are not kosher. So you can eat kosher foods, you cannot eat non-kosher foods. That's pretty cut and dry. Examples of kosher foods. You can have beef. As long as if this is the cow and this is the head, if the meat comes from here forward, you can eat it. If it comes from here backwards, you can't. Okay? You can eat sheep or goats. And there are others that I can't think of right now. You cannot eat certain foods, though, in terms of meat. You cannot eat any pork product. So pig is out. Definitely out. Any rodents? Can't eat them. Anything that slithers on the ground, you cannot eat. Any birds of prey, you cannot eat. So you could eat chicken, goose. You cannot eat hawk or vulture or eagle or something like that. Okay, so certain foods are kosher, certain foods are not. But even the foods that are kosher, you have to prepare them the right way, which means you have to drain all the blood out. Because in Judaism, life is in the blood. So you can't eat the blood. So if you like your steaks not very well done, it's not kosher. They got to be well done. But really, it doesn't matter how you cook them. It matters how you prepare the meat. So all the blood has to be drained out before you can cook it. Okay? So that's two things. So there are certain foods that are kosher, certain foods are not. And even the ones that are kosher in terms of meat, you have to prepare it the right way. Here's a third facet of kosher foods is you cannot combine meat and dairy. And this is what I was talking about specific verses. There's two specific verses in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy that talk about this. And the verse is you cannot cook a kid in its mother's milk. So you can't cook a baby goat in the mother's milk. And from that, a whole system of separating meat and dairy come. You want to make sure you avoid that, and so you separate all meat and all dairy. Okay? So if you like hamburgers, it's great. If you like a cheese sandwich, that's great. But you cannot have a cheeseburger, right? Because that's combining meat and dairy. And strict Jewish homes today will have actually two different sets of pots and pans, almost two different kitchens. You'll have a dairy set of pot and pans and a meat set of pot and pans to make sure that you don't combine these two. Okay? Not every Jew followed all of these laws all that strictly. Some did, some did not. Think about Christians today. Some are very conscious of wanting to do everything the way that they know they should. Some Christians are pretty lax in their observance, right? It's the same way back then. They all agree that this idea was important because it's part of the law, but how you practice it, that's situational. So even today, some Jews will keep strictly kosher kitchens. You won't have any meat and dairy together. And when they go out to eat, it's the same thing. They'll only eat at places they know they can get kosher food. But others, if you go out to eat, you can eat whichever you want. But when you eat at home, you're going to eat kosher. Or, let's say, I just don't like these rules. So in theory, I think they're important. And if I can, I'll do it. But I'm not going to go out of my way to eat kosher, right? There's just there's a broad range of observance, okay? And then this idea of no idols, that you can't worship idols. These four things made Jews very distinctive in the first century, all throughout the Roman Empire. Now, it didn't matter so much if you lived in Israel, but if you lived in Athens or Rome or Cairo, Egypt, or somewhere else, no one else is taking one day off a week, right? Except the Jews are. Now, the Romans were really good at taking days off a week, days off of work. They had festivals, week-long festivals, but not in the regular pattern of one day a week. The Jews, by the first century, were really the only people circumcising infants. And this meant that Jews could not eat very well with non-Jews. If you wanted to observe a kosher diet, you can't really eat with Gentiles unless the Gentiles are preparing food the right way, and they're not. At least it's very, very rare for a Gentile to be that in the ancient world, but even in this world, right? Because there's just a lot of laws you got to know. There are a lot of rules you got to follow. Okay? And then Jews would not go to the temples They wouldn't go to Temple of Zeus, Temple of Aphrodite, things like that. All of this stems from the importance of the Torah. Because God said this, it's important. And so you try and do it. But how do you practice it? Well, that was a matter of interpretation, right? So that you should practice it was important. But how you practice it differed a little bit. All right.
So is that a modern day equivalent of, we have denominations in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Jews have, Orthodox, Reformed, Hasidic. Is it because of how they interpret things? I mean, I know that's not the only answer, but isn't many of the reasons how they interpret the Torah?
Yeah.
That they're labeled in those groups?
Some of it is. And so if you were to put those groups on the spectrum, I'll give you the three main groups. Orthodox Jews, and sometimes there's another group called ultra-Orthodox, or Haredim is the term in Israel. They would definitely practice the kosher laws very strictly, right? They would not work on the Sabbath. By anyone's definition of work, they wouldn't do it, right? So they're very strict observers. You could put them on the conservative end of the spectrum. The conservative Jews, so there's Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Those are the three main groups. Orthodox Jews are going to observe pretty strictly. Conservative Jews are mostly going to observe, but we live in a modern world, and sometimes it's hard, and that's more than thinking. Reform Jews think, we want to fit in. I mean, so the Reform movement actually started in Europe, and they said, we're living in Germany or Austria or Poland. We want to be German or Austrian or Polish. We don't want to look different all the time. And so while some of these things are still important, the practice is just not as strong. So yeah, you can put them kind of on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. All right. So Jewish sects or parties. So what I explained before is just that Torah is important, and there are certain things, especially that mark Jews off as distinct in the ancient world, and it was because of Torah observance, because they thought following God's law was important enough that they were willing to look different to their non-Jewish neighbors. Now this is kind of internal in Jewish society, okay? So that was kind of outward looking. Jews looked a little strange to other people because they followed certain laws. Internally, and now we're talking about Israel proper, there were certain groups that had very distinct ideas on how you follow the Jewish law, okay? And what they said, sometimes they were just talking to themselves, and sometimes a few other people listened, but a lot of people didn't listen to any of these groups, okay? The Sadducees. The Sadducees, I'm going to just give you a brief description of each of these, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time looking at Pharisees. Okay? The Sadducees were a very powerful and small group. The Sadducees were the Jerusalem aristocracy, so they were the elite in Jerusalem society, and they were priests. If I can remember this right. It's a kind of a catchy saying, but I have to remember to say it right. All Sadducees were priests, but not all priests were Sadducees. Okay? So only some of the priests were Sadducees. And usually it was the elite, wealthy ones who had important positions in the temple. Okay? So in Jesus' time, there were a couple of high priests that are important in Jesus' trial and crucifixion, Annas and Caiaphas. They were Sadducees. They had political clout. Okay? This is a small group of people, but a powerful group of people based in Jerusalem. There's a couple of things we know about them. One, they did not believe in a resurrection of the dead or an afterlife. So this world is all there is. They're a very here and now oriented group. They also had a very literal understanding of the Torah. So what Moses said in the first 5 books, because they would understand Moses being the author, what Moses said, that's what he meant. We're going to interpret very literally. Okay? And they were fairly strict in how they interpreted. Yeah, those are the things I'll say about the Sadducees. Okay, the Essenes. We're going to talk about the Essenes the entire time next week. So I'll give you like 30 seconds on the Essenes. They were a group that split from the temple because they thought what was happening in the temple was not appropriate. And some of them decided to live on the shores of the Dead Sea and write what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were a middle group between these two. So the Sadducees are very literal interpreters of Torah. The Pharisees were pretty lenient interpreters of Torah. And they were in the middle. They were also in the middle in terms of an afterlife. Sadducees thought there was no afterlife. Pharisees were sure there was. The Essenes, they're more the Pharisees, but they didn't all think that there was an afterlife. And they thought that free will and predestination could go very well together. Okay? As did the Pharisees, actually. They both did. There was about 4,000 Essenes, is the number that a guy named Josephus gives us. So very few of these people, about 4,000 of these people. When we get to the Pharisees, about 6,000 Pharisees. Okay? Now, in terms of overall population, that's very small. Most people did not belong to either one of these parties. Most people were what you just call common Jews. Okay? These are the three main sects or parties in Jesus' day. Now, I put two more down here, but I put a space in between. There are two other groups that probably functioned like Jewish sects or parties, but weren't quite these groups. So the Zealots were people who were very military-minded, wanted to overthrow the Romans. They functioned as a small group within Jewish society that had very distinctive views, as did the Christians. I think the earliest Christians looked a lot like a Jewish sect or party. They practiced Judaism. They thought it was important. They read the Torah. They thought that was important. And they were all Jews in the very beginning. Right? So in the first couple decades, I think Christianity looked a lot like a Jewish sect or a party. So I put them on this spectrum for you. Yes?
All of those would have been in Jerusalem. Would all of those have been in the different smaller communities as well?
Good question. Sadducees were definitely in Jerusalem. There were priests from all over, but the Sadducees would have been in Jerusalem. The Essenes, some of them were in Jerusalem, some of them split from Jerusalem. Like they said, what's happening here is not right, and so we're going elsewhere. The Pharisees were also based in Jerusalem, but they seem to have had a broader influence up, say in the Galilee region, where Jesus was. Their presence was there in ways that the Sadducees and Essenes were not. But they were not a dominant group by any stretch of the imagination. Okay? And these, partly based in Jerusalem, but a little broader as well. But Jerusalem was the big city, so if you want your voice to be heard, you got to go to the big city. A priest, so the question is, what's the distinction between a priest and a rabbi? A priest is someone who can officiate in the temple. So they have an official position. And part of that position, at least before the year 70, is that they could offer sacrifices in the temple. Rabbis had no official position in the temple at all. So the rabbis were seen as more teachers, where the priests could be, they were teachers, but they were also part of the sacrificial cult, which is the term that's usually used. Although we think that's a negative term often, we think of a cult. But when you talk about sacrifice in the ancient world, you just talk about a cultic system. So they were in charge of that Jewish sacrificial system, and they could teach, where rabbis were only teachers.
Some ordination of rabbis, or could anybody become a teacher?
So I'm going to answer that first by talking about a priest. You couldn't just become a priest. You had to be born a priest. Okay, so you had to be of the right priestly line in order to become a priest. You could be a terrible priest, but you're still a priest. Right? A rabbi is it's based on merit. And so anyone could become a rabbi as long as the distinguishing thing was as long as you were a good interpreter of the law. If you could interpret the Torah well and have good reasons for why you're doing so, then you could become a rabbi in theory. And the way you become a rabbi is you become an apprentice. So Jesus had 12 disciples. This was a very common thing in Jewish society for a rabbi or a teacher to attract other people who would walk around with him and learn. So you're not just going to a Sunday school class for an hour and learning and going away and coming back for another hour next week. The idea is, if you wouldn't want to be my disciple, but if you were my disciple, you would know everything about me. Do you know how I treated my kids? Do you know how I talked to my wife? You'd know if I really prepared for this morning or if I just threw it together at the last minute. You'd know everything, right? And actually, there are funny rabbinic stories where a rabbi's disciple, I probably shouldn't tell you this story. A rabbi's disciple, sometimes they would sneak in and watch the rabbi and his wife having sex because they said, we got to know everything. Okay? The idea is you become a rabbi by following someone, by learning from them, right? So in the same way you would apprentice as a blacksmith or a carpenter for years and years, you do the same thing, but it's Torah study. Okay? Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes?
I assume that for all these people, rabbis and Sadducees, we're talking about men, right?
We are talking about men. Christians are different. The early Christian movement was different, and the zealots could have been different. There may have been some female Essenes. But as far as I know, I don't know any stories where there are female Sadducees or Pharisees.
But the families, the wives and children of these leaders would have been considered part of that group? Or were only these high priests themselves the Sadducees?
Let me see if I can answer your question this way. From what I know, if you're talking about Sadducees and Pharisees, only the male could have been the Sadducee or Pharisee. But there was no you weren't like a card-carrying Pharisee. Or it wasn't that you got inducted into a society, right? So there were some leading Pharisees, and there were just people who followed the Pharisees. And so you could almost call them Pharisees because they do what the Pharisees were saying, but they might not be capital P Pharisees, right? I should say capital F almost because it sounds like an F, right? Pharisees. And so in that sense, if you're talking about followers, men and women both, for sure. But in terms of the leadership, I think it was male, from what I know. But that was true for everything in the ancient world. There were very few leadership positions that were open for women, just the way it worked. Not just in Jewish society, and all societies. Okay. Let me give you a few ways in which the Pharisees differed from others now, okay? I have less time than I thought I was going to have. It's mostly because I blabbered on at the beginning, not because of your questions. Your questions are great. The Pharisees had distinctive views on how you follow the Jewish law. That's one of the things that set them apart. Now, Christians, if you only have the New Testament to read, it sounds like the Pharisees are very exacting and very scrupulous and very zealous, and they make it hard to follow. And when you read Jewish sources, the Pharisees are the ones who make it easy to follow, which is interesting. Right? So here's an example. Let's talk about purity issues, actually. There are certain things that can make you pure, certain things that make you impure. And purity and impurity, on the one hand, and sin, on the other hand, are two totally separate things. They are not the same. So certain things can make you impure, and they relate to things like human procreation, birth, and death. Okay? So, childbirth and menstruation can make a woman impure. Coming into contact with semen make a man and woman impure. Genital discharges, so a miscarriage or gonorrhea or something like that, they make you impure by touching it. Touching a dead body or being in the room with a dead body makes you impure, which basically means everyone's impure most of their life. Because these are normal human things, and that was fine. Being impure was not a bad thing. But some people wanted to be pure, more often than not. Right? Now, the only time you had to be pure is to go into the Jewish temple. In order to go into God's presence, you had to be in a ritually pure state, which means that most people live most of their life in an impure state. Okay? But
is there a certain period of time where you would go through a ritual before you go into the...
Yes. So the way it worked is you would have to immerse yourself in water. Okay, that's what made you appear. So this is an ancient mikveh. There are modern mikvehs. If you think of a swimming pool and make it really small, that's a modern mikveh. Okay? So you'd come down into the water, you'd immerse yourself in water, and you go back up. Okay? So this is a mikveh right outside the temple in Jerusalem. Here's one that was found in Migdal, or the town of Mary Magdalene. Got to go down into the water, immerse yourself, come back up. And then you have to wait till sundown, and then you're pure. Okay? So if you want to go to the Jewish temple, normally you have to immerse yourself in water, go back to your hotel or your tent or wherever you're staying if you're visiting, wait till the next day, and then you can go to the temple. Okay? Hundreds of mikvahs have been found in and around Jerusalem, but not just around Jerusalem. In all parts of Galilee, like 4 or 5 day walk. Jews in the first century seemed to think that purity was a really good thing, even if they weren't going into the temple. And the Pharisees had ideas on this. Okay, most people thought, if you go down in the water and come back up, that's fine. But the Pharisees said, but what about the quality of the water? Now, if you're just thinking about cleanliness, this is going to get dirty. Right? That didn't seem to bother people. So I think what they probably do is they go in the water, come back out, and then they might go get cleaned up, right? But you'd be pure, and then you could go take an equivalent of a shower. The issue is that the water is supposed to be living water. It means it can't be stagnant water. And if you've got it in a pool, it's stagnant water. So the ideal thing, if you're going to immerse, you want to do it in a river if you can. So John the Baptist is baptizing in a river. That's immersion, is what he's doing. Okay? But most people didn't live by rivers. So they dig this out. This took a lot of work to dig down into rock and then plaster it in so that water won't drain out. And most people just said, this is good enough. But the Pharisees said, no, we need living water, not stagnant water. So there have been some, this is a model, but there have been some that have found like this, where there's two pools. This is the one you go down in, and then there's one next to it. So the Pharisees would fill this with water, but there's a channel. And when that water runs between one and the next, then it's living water. And then this is pure, and then you can immerse yourself there and be pure. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, if you're a Pharisee, right. So in some ways, this seems like, why? This is a lot of work. But again, if God gave the Torah, if he gave the law, and he said, got to immerse yourself in living water, which is, those exact words are not given, but that was the understanding, then you got to do it appropriately. You got to do it the right way. Good question. What's strange, so a lot of them are not near rivers, right? If you lived near a river, you could just go to a river. What's strange is like this is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. You could just walk 50 feet and go and just jump in the lake, and you're good, right? Because it's moving water. But enough Jews must have thought this was important that you go to all the trouble of building this. Okay? So ritual purity was important. And the Pharisees had distinct views on this. Tithing. Here's another one. Jewish farmers knew that you had to tithe 1/10 of your agricultural produce. Everyone knew that. And tithing is like taxation, though, in the ancient world. Like, you want to define how much you actually owe. You don't want to give too much. Or too little. So, what kind of foods count? So the law says you tithe and you give it to the Levites and priests, people in charge of the temple, so that they can eat. So, okay, barley, wheat, oats, like that stuff, humans can eat that. But what about things like mint and dill and cumin, spices? Look at your handout, Matthew 23. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew 23. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law." This was clearly a debate in the ancient world. Do you have to tithe things that were not food? Because it was really for the priests to eat and the Levites to eat. So the Pharisees were, but not everyone else was. Right? So, and they seemed to be thinking that was an important thing. Right? So tithing, what you tithe matters. Now the rules for tithing animals was different. You would offer the firstborn of the flock, but then the rest of them you didn't have to offer. You didn't have to offer 1/10 of an animal because you'd kill them all, right? So just one animal. Yes? I don't think so. I think it was agricultural produce. Harvest time. That's when you do it. And there are some laws that talk about a second tithe, which is for the poor and the orphans and the needy and widows and that group of people, and that's a different tithe. But these laws only apply to Israel. So if you were a Jew in the diaspora, lived in like Rome, didn't have to tithe. But if you lived in Israel, you probably did, because that would go to the priests. Okay? The Pharisees had distinctive views on this. I'll give you one more that the Pharisees had distinctive views on. Can you carry food on the Sabbath? Let's say you're living in Capernaum. You want to know how far you can walk with food on the Sabbath. Well, the law is you can do it inside your house. That's what the Pharisees said. You can carry food inside your house. But what if you want to go to Grandma's house? And they're just down the street. Well, something the Pharisees did is they linked houses. They put door frames or lintels connecting the houses, So you could walk down the street because you're really still in a house, right, on the Sabbath. It's a way to still observe the law, but to make it easier to follow. You're still following the law, right? I mean, in some ways it might seem like cheating, but what it's doing is what that law is doing is it's saying, we understand that not everyone can live according to like a very strict interpretation, and we want people to obey the law. And so we're going to make it as broad as we can so that people are still obeying the law, right? And that was the important part. Okay. Let me make one final comment about the Pharisees. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard that the Pharisees were very strict interpreters of the law. And in a phrase like Matthew 23, it talks about, Jesus says that you're a hypocrite. They're hypocrites. My hunch is that Jesus didn't usually think that of the Pharisees. I think this is a specific moment when he's talking to some Pharisees. I don't think this is a common view for Jesus. I think actually Jesus and the Pharisees are pretty close in terms of what they taught. Because Jesus seems to be making things somewhat easier for people and somewhat harder. Pharisees are making things somewhat easier but also somewhat harder. They're doing similar things. They both care about the Jewish law. And I think that the Pharisees get a very bad rap in our society in ways that they shouldn't. I want you to think about them in very positive terms. And here's why. Because if God gave the law, then you need to know how to follow it. And so, yeah, you can make tons of rules to make sure you follow those rules, but all of that is in the spirit of trying to do what God asks. So the Pharisees will talk about heavy commandments or weighty commandments, like do not murder is a weighty commandment. How do you make sure that you don't murder someone? Well, think about what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, I tell you, don't even get angry with a person. That's a very Pharisaic thing to say. You're trying to protect the heavy command by making a lighter commandment. The lighter commandment is don't get angry, because the heavy commandment is don't murder. How can you make sure you don't murder? Don't even get angry. You can kill people and not be angry, but you really can't murder someone without anger being some element in there. I was in a jury trial once. Well, I wasn't on trial, but I was in a murder trial where we had to distinguish between murder, first and second degree murder, manslaughter and stuff, and I found out all these distinctions, right? I want you to think about the Pharisees in a positive light. I think that they were really trying to observe the commands of God in a very specific way. Sometimes not everyone agreed with them, but everyone agreed the law was important, just how you observe it. And the Pharisees tried to make things easier, by and large. All right, thank you very much.